Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you here on such a chilly day, inside such a chilly building. And thank you for coming. The concert is all Bach, and it's to commemorate an anniversary of his death. 275 years since this great man died, and it seemed appropriate to mark this. The anniversary actually falls on Monday, the 28th, so this is the most convenient date to hold such a commemoration, in a commemoration. Should there be any necessity to evacuate the building quickly, that's the best way. Both doors are open, the outside doors are open. If by any unfortunate chance it's that end of the building that collapses or is in a grave conflagration, then you'll need to go out carefully, sensibly down the stairs and through the maze and eventually find yourself outside. The planning of this concert could have posed very many problems because of the amount of work that Johann actually wrote over such a long period of time. But we came to a consensus that we could do a kind of chronological survey of his work. So we do begin with the Passacaglia, which is an early work, and ending up with something later in his career. The Passacaglia was probably written when he was about 20 or 21, which is quite a phenomenal achievement by anybody. He had not long been employed as organist at Arnstadt as a very young man, asked for permission for 3 weeks holiday to go and see the great Dietrich Buxtehude in Lübeck, and returned some 3 months later, much to the annoyance of the town council, his employers at the time. But they kept him on, so they must have actually realised it was quite a good thing having this young chap going. The Passacaglia, it has resonances with what Buxtehude had done. He had clearly picked up many influences. The beginning especially has echoes of Buxtehude about it. But it's not just that. It starts with this theme, which is quite extended, immediately goes into this lilting, kind of melancholic theme and develops, and it just doesn't get bigger and more dense. He breaks it down again, so from 3 or 4 parts with the theme in the pedal for 5 or 6 variations, suddenly the theme is in the top part, right on top. It thins out to 2 parts, harmonic language, to 1 part, and without the theme expressly being played to you, but it's there harmonically. And then he builds it up again, brings it all to a 5-part conclusion of the Passacaglia almost. And I say almost because a lot of people call this a Passacaglia and fugue, which it isn't. He didn't call it that, he calls it Passacaglia, that's it. The fugue at the end, which is almost as long as everything that had come before, is just the final variation. It's the summation of everything, and it's a double fugue as well, just to cap everything off. It's an amazing piece, and even more amazing for such a young man. We will come back about halfway through and give you some more comments about the second half, but for now, my esteemed colleague, Christopher Cobo, will give you some.
So the second piece on the program is, in a way, not central to Bach's output, but it does illustrate some interesting things about him. If you know Vivaldi's string concertos, you will know this piece, because the musical material is by Vivaldi, not by Bach. But Bach made transcriptions of quite a lot of Vivaldi's music, both for the organ and for the harpsichord. And this piece that I'm playing is one of those transcriptions by Bach of the string music for the organ. And it's interesting what Bach was able to do in order to changed the music from a string piece into a really unusual and interesting organ piece. Most of the musical material is Vivaldi's, but he can't resist occasionally adding to the harmony and the counterpoint. So if you do know the string version, you'll hear, especially in places where Vivaldi's very fond of having rests, where everybody stops and then they all come in again. Bach always fills those in with something. So you might notice those if you know the other version. The other interesting thing in terms of Bach's career is that his encounter with the music of the Italians, particularly Vivaldi and the string concertos, really contributed to Bach's mature compositional style, because he had started off very much in the tradition of the northern German organ and church music school, and might conceivably have just stayed within that orbit had he not encountered these very recently composed string concertos of Vivaldi. And so, in a way, this concerto that I'm playing represents that element that came into his music and was fused with what he already had from the North German organists into his mature style.
your way out of church this afternoon, you will see at least one, maybe two very charming people with begging baskets. If you'd like to divest yourselves of any cash that you have on you, we'll take cards as well. As well as feeding starving musicians, a portion of whatever is taken today, we will donate to the church here towards the upkeep of the instrument. It's, as you see, a very large instrument, and maintenance is not cheap and has to be done by specialists. So it's an ongoing project, and they are very worthy. So thank you for that. If you think you've mentioned J.S. Bach, depending on your musical taste, you might think of Brandenburg concertos. You might think of the Mass in B minor. You probably will think of that infamous piece, the Toccata and Fugue in D minor, which may or may not be by Bach and may or may not originally have been written for organ. That said, it's associated with him. The other great genre of musical composition are chorale preludes. And they are just that. They are preludes to chorales. So it's still done very much in the Lutheran tradition, where written chorales, newly composed or from the repertoire, or improvised introductions to the congregational singing happens. In the Anglican tradition, we've got very lazy, and we just play over the first line of the hymn and you're off. So maybe we should do something about that. But in choosing something else to represent Bach this afternoon, some chorale preludes, where do we start? There are so many of them, and he wrote them from his very earliest part of his career right up through his mature years to the very last piece he probably wrote. On his deathbed, it is said, dictated by the hand of God, I'm sure. So these are three kind of representative styles of chorale prelude that he wrote. Starting with Nun freut euch, lieben Christen gemein, that is actually an Advent, based on an Advent chorale. It's a trio in texture, so there are three different strands of music going on at the same time, and the chorale is kind of in the middle of this texture. Both hands are fully engaged with doing twiddly things, so the chorale is given to the pedal part, and you'll hear it clearly on a trumpet stop come out. So that's one style. Schmucke dich, o liebe Seele, is a very profound chorale prelude. It's a communion hymn, based on a communion hymn, Deck Thyself, my soul, with gladness, still in the English hymnal, sung by many traditions. It's a very, very fine chorale itself, and perhaps one of the most beautiful chorale preludes written on it. A kind of continuous accompaniment, which is glorious in itself, and over the top of that, this time in the right hand, a very ornamented, embellished version of the chorale tune itself. So it's quite difficult to tell what the tune actually is, but I'm sure Lutheran congregations would have known, seeing the title and hearing the kind of key tonality that it's in. And then finally, Vor deinem Thron trete ich. This is actually the chorale tune for Wenn wir in höchsten Nöten sein, so when in the hour of utmost need. But Bach was writing this, it really was virtually on his deathbed, and it's quite short. But he used that tune for a different set of words, which are Vor deinem Thron, before thy throne I now appear. He knew he was going. I mean, it was very dramatic, very theatrical, really. And this again is an ornamented chorale melody in the top part, in the right hand, and it's just delicious and profound. And going on our little chronological journey, it seemed a very good example to give you.
Much of Bach's organ music was not published during his lifetime, but towards the end of his life he put together a number of collections under the rather uninspiring title Klavierübung, or keyboard exercise. And the third of these collections is the one from which I'm going to be playing this afternoon. The first one were the keyboard partitas, the second one were also two keyboard works, and the fourth part of the Klavierübung was the famous Goldberg variations. But the third part was for organ, and it's mainly a set of chorale preludes, but it begins, the first piece in the collection is an enormous prelude, and the last piece in the collection is a fugue. And so, although they're separated in the actual published collection by a large number of chorale preludes, they're very often played together as a prelude and fugue, and certainly belong together. They're in the same key, and they have many of the same kind of associations. Bach, as you see from our title, is sometimes called the fifth evangelist, and whereas the previous piece that I played doesn't really represent that very well. It's another side of his musical output. This final piece does really represent his many ways of symbolizing the idea of the Trinity. The prelude has three main musical ideas, although they are presented one after the other, but then they reappear in quite a complex form. If you call the three ideas A, B, C, it's kind of A, B, A, B, A, C, A, B, C, A, that kind of pattern. You'll hear them coming back. But three main ideas. It's also in the key of E flat, which has three flats. That may or may not be significant, but knowing Bach, it probably was intentional. The fugue at the end, which is known in English-speaking countries as the St. Anne fugue, because its main theme is the same, although not derived from, but the same as the hymn that you will probably know as O God Our Help in Ages Past. Da 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 da. So that in the English-speaking world, that tune is known as St. Anne, the hymn tune. And so it's the nickname of this fugue has always been the St. Anne fugue. But it too is in three sections. It's in a sense a triple fugue. It has three subjects. The first one, you'll hear the St. Anne melody at the beginning. The second one is very contrasting. It's fast and running. But the interesting thing about this is that the first theme is combined with the subsequent two. So all the way through, sooner or later, if you listen carefully, often in a different rhythmic guise, you will hear da dum ba dum ba da da dum going through after we've heard each of the three different fugue subjects. So it's a monumental kind of structure that he's created here. And so yes, it's sometimes called, because of the three parts, the three flats. Also, if you look at the entire Klavierübung 3, there are 27 pieces in it, which is, of course, 3 times 3 times 3. So it's very likely that he intended this kind of number symbolism for the Trinity.
Just to add one little piece of added information for you and a help for you. The chorale preludes I'm going to play, I'm going to reverse them and turn them into chorale postludes. So I'm actually going to play you the chorale tune of each piece first, and then play the chorale prelude. So you've got an idea of what you should be listening out for, but we won't be singing them. It's all right.
not sound. Bach never had this problem. Had a mechanical instrument, nothing electrical could go wrong. Anyway, I will play the St. Anne Fugue for you, but I'm afraid it's going to sound a little less magnificent than it should, because the main manual on the organ is the one that's now got this stuck note upon it. However, you've been kind enough to come out in the cold weather and to sit through to this point, so let me at least play you the notes, even if they don't sound quite as splendid as we would like them to. The adaptation, of course, is unrehearsed.